Yeah.
Okay, so Gary, we're going to switch to the finances.
Okay.
There's been a number of questions from the group about how we're doing with our finances, if we're going to get more stimulus money, our services being cut, how is it impacting our employees from layoffs or just overall morale. That's a lot I just threw at
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of I wouldn't say it's a bleak picture, but it's been one of the darkest black clouds, that we've had to weather through this pandemic. We actually did have a special study session of the board, our board of directors yesterday. It's now our second one, working through the budget for this next coming year, which has been an incredibly challenging process. One of the greatest periods I can remember of uncertainty. And here you're trying to forecast the future, albeit only a year, but you're trying to forecast, what are going to be the patient volumes in surgery and medical and inpatient and outpatient, and very difficult to predict that. So we spent a lot of time yesterday on that. We also, earlier this morning, our leadership team held its monthly meeting. Melinda Tupper, our Chief Financial Officer, shared with the team what our financial results have been through the 11 months ended May 31st. So our fiscal year runs July 1 to June 30th, so we're just about a week away from ending this fiscal year 2020. And through that 11-month period, and again, this was largely occurred in the months of March, April, and May. So really over the last 3 months, where we saw this dramatic change in our financial condition. But through that 11-month period, we're roughly $38 million under budget in our revenue, and that was largely driven by shutting down non-emergent elective surgeries, closing a lot of our services. Fortunately, most of those have reopened, although with respect to inpatient elective surgery, we're still keeping, kind of a governor on the throttle so that we continue to keep inpatient beds open. But because of that dramatic drop in revenue, through the 11 months, we actually have, and this is, I'll say, pre-stimulus. So we have a $29 million operating loss through the 11 months of the fiscal year. But we have received roughly $9.8 million in stimulus funds that pertain to that 11-month period. Again, mostly just March, April, and May. So after taking into account those $9.8 million of stimulus funds, we still have a year-to-date operating loss of $19 million. That is $37 million below our budget. And our budget, again, was a pretty skinny budget, budgeting for about a 2.5% margin. So we bring in about $800 million a year in total operating revenue from all sources. And after the dust all settles, after we've paid our staff wages and benefits and paid for drugs and supplies and physicians and utilities and all of those costs that go into operating a hospital, there's about 2.5% that's left over, translates to about $15 million. We then take that $15 million, and that's what we use to repay the investors who've bought Kaweah Delta municipal bonds over the years. I mean, we built the Kaweah Tower, cost $200 million. $150 million of that was funded by issuing bonds, tax-exempt municipal bonds, out into the public. We sell them all across the country. But we have to pay the principal and interest on those bonds as they come due every year. So it's that operating margin that we use to make those repayments to those bond holders. It's also what we use to fund most of our capital equipment purchases. So when we're replacing equipment or advancing to a new state of technology or repairing facilities or wanting to expand, that's all funded out of that operating margin. So it takes a positive 2.5% margin, or that $15 million positive margin, to meet those obligations. But instead of having a positive $15 million margin, we have a negative $19 million margin, even after receiving those stimulus funds. So it is, I guess I can't sugarcoat it. It is a dire situation right now, when hospitals up and down the state, hospitals across the country are experiencing. The one thing that gives me hope and encouragement is that Kaweah Delta has been and continues to be a well-run, well-managed hospital. We are resilient. We have the resolve to take actions that are necessary to keep us financially solvent and to sustain us into the future. Fortunately, we came into this pandemic with having deep, financial reserves that we are certainly drawing upon to fund the operating losses. To date, I did talk about we've received really 3 different stimulus payments over this period of the pandemic. Back on April 11th, we received electronic deposit of $11.4 million from the federal government. That was followed by a second payment of $1.2 million that we got about 2 weeks after that. And then also, the federal government suspended the application of what's called the sequestration reduction. And you may remember that from a number of years ago, the federal government, in order to balance its budget, instituted a 2% cut in federal funding across virtually every program, including Medicare funding. So that 2%, while it was supposed to be kind of a temporary measure, has actually been made a permanent measure. And that costs us about $2.1 million a year in Medicare funding that we've now been incurring for many, many years. Well, that sequestration cut was suspended back in May of 2020. So all in all, we've received about $14 million in total stimulus funds, but it has stopped now. We have not received anything more, and there are no assurances that we will receive anything more from the federal government, and the state has not provided a single penny of financial support. I did share with you that we implored the governor, pleaded with the governor to help rescue his 500 California hospitals that have been devastated by this, essentially responding to his executive order, following his direction to shut everything down to create the surge capacity. But there has been no financial support whatsoever by the state. So we're hoping that the governor, I know the governor is really banking on the federal government providing stimulus funds to the state. And if that happens, maybe that will be the trigger where the state is willing to provide hospitals funding. But to date, there's been nothing.